Our interviewee today is Dr. Betty Drees. Dr. Betty Drees is the Dean Emerita at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I'd like to start with just some background questions, if I might. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born and grew up in Wellington, Kansas, which is about 30 miles south of Wichita.
So did you go to high school in Wellington as well?
Yes, I did.
Did you guys play sports against any of the Wichita high schools?
Occasionally, because we were a smaller school. We were 3A and the Wichita schools were all 4A and 5A. So we played, I think, campus occasionally, but we really didn't play the larger Wichita schools.
So the reason I'm asking is because John Atkinson, who is a distinguished academic rheumatologist and former Hughes investigator and former chair of medicine here, went to high school in Wichita and then went to the University of Kansas to medical school. And I think he's probably a few years older than you. You didn't run into him by any chance, did you?
Not that I recall. I graduated from medical school in 1979, so he may be ahead of me.
Yeah, he was ahead of you. He was quite a bit ahead of you, actually. So what did your parents do? What kind of, how did they make a living and so on?
Well, my parents had a farm, and then my dad also had a machine shop. He trained in machine shops during World War II, worked in the aircraft industry in Wichita during World War II, and then after that, then he opened his own machine shop, making mostly airplane parts. And my mother worked as the office person, kept the books, answered the telephones, and things like that.
So was he like a contractor for Cessna, or how did that work?
He did contract work for Cessna, Boeing, for the federal government. I think he even made parts that went on some of the space shuttles and certainly on airplanes. And he had a smaller shop, so he did a lot of custom things. So if there was a custom tool that they needed built in small quantities, he might make things like that. But lots of bushings and things, just all kinds of things, but mostly for the aircraft industry.
Was he primarily a machinist who was a gentleman farmer on the side, or was he primarily a farmer who was a machinist on the side?
I would say he started off primarily as a farmer, and then was a welder and a machinist on the side. And then later in life, he was primarily, business. It was a full-time business with a number of employees, and then farmed on the side. And then my brothers also picked up a lot of the farming and did a lot of that.
It's interesting. The reason I'm curious is because my father farmed, with three brothers, and none of them had to take outside work, but it was very common where I grew up for the local farmers to have additional jobs, because even then farming was becoming less and less profitable. And
virtually all the farmers had other jobs, at least during the winter time. They were, a number of different things. Did mail delivery, drove school buses. A lot of them had other positions, sold insurance, other jobs.
So were you a traditional, farm child? Did you drive the tractor? Did you take care of animals?
I got the chickens. My brothers got the bigger chores and driving the tractors. I got the chickens and more of the indoor things. So I could, I learned to harvest and to bake and preserve and can and all of those things.
Did you belong to 4-H?
No.
So what made you decide to become a physician? It sounds like there were no physicians in your immediate family.
I had a great grandfather who was a physician. Otherwise, no, not physicians. We were a math science family. My dad's brothers were chemists and engineers, and two of my brothers have engineering degrees. I married an engineer. So we were a math science family, and I always liked the sciences. I liked being outdoors. I liked, seeing what was going on with all kinds of animals out in wild and tame out in the pastures. But I also liked literature and humanities. Was an avid reader. growing up in a smaller community at the time that I did, most of the careers were encouraged for women were nursing, teaching, and secretarial work. So when I went to college, because I was a good student and liked sciences, medicine was something that I considered, but wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. So started as an English major, humanities major, and always kind of considered that I might like something in medicine. And so took the pre-med requirements as well. And then eventually decided that I would like to do something in science. And one of my advisors asked me what I was thinking about doing at that time. And I was thinking about either PA or PhD in microbiology. And she said, well, what about medicine? At that time, I said, well, I'm married. I already have a child. I can't go into medicine. And she said, well, men do it all the time. And I thought, okay, I'll take the rest of the pre-med courses and I'll take the MCAT and I'll apply. And if I get an interview, I'll interview. And if I get accepted, I'll make a decision then. But when that acceptance letter came, somewhere along the line, I'd already made the decision. And so, of course, took the acceptance.
So did you meet your husband in college then? Is that what
Yes,
happened?
I did. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so you would have been, it sounds like right on the more or less the kind of leading edge of Title IX and how it impacted on medical school admissions and women representation and so on. How many women were in your class?
It was about a third of our class, 30%, I think, of our class starting in 1979 were women. And that was the most that they'd ever had. And that compares to at the beginning of the 1970s, about 10% of medical school classes were women. So tremendous impact of Title IX over that time frame.
I had a similar experience, although I'm older. And I entered medical school in 1970, and there were 8 women out of 108 people in my medical school class. And the year I graduated, the incoming class was over 40% women. And it was clearly led by the dean and the vice chancellor at that time, Tom Kinney and Bill Anley, and made this a priority. But it was also driven, obviously, by by the impact of federal law and federal funding and so on. So
when I started, go ahead.
No,
when I started medical school, I had never met a woman physician, so there really weren't role models.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to say, I think that same thing is true for me. Although it turns out I have a distant great aunt who was a physician in Kansas, graduated from one of the one-year proprietary schools in central Kansas, and then after her husband was shot dead by a jealous grocer, she packed up her daughter and then undertook a full 4-year course at Creighton, and then ultimately finished her career in Oregon. But I never knew her. I didn't know anything about her until I read her daughter's book about her. So was your husband supportive of this decision? He was presumably at the point where he was getting ready to start his own career.
Oh, he's very supportive. So at that time, he was, we were living in Wichita, and he was an engineer, he still is an engineer, and working for a consulting company. And we started off when I started medical school in Kansas City at the University of Kansas, our intent was that I would do my 2 years of basic sciences there and then transfer to the Wichita campus for the clinical years. And he was still working in Wichita, and he would come up on weekends, and we had a 2-year-old son, and that just wasn't workable. So he changed jobs and took a position here in Kansas City, and we've lived in Kansas City ever since. Yes, he has been always tremendously supportive of my career.
So I don't remember what it was. It's one of these factoids that popped up somewhere that listed engineers as being the best husbands, and pragmatic, not prone to becoming over emotional and so on and so on. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Well, he's been a good husband to me, and he's a mechanical engineer. So my case study of one is very much in agreement with that.
What influenced you to choose internal medicine?
I was interested in lots of different things, and I think for people who like a lot of different fields of medicine, internal medicine is very attractive. I actually applied in both the ophthalmology and the internal medicine match, but withdrew from the ophthalmology match because I wanted something broader. And so that was, it was just that broad appeal of, I considered it very intellectual, and I liked the faculty who were in internal medicine, and I liked the patient contact.
Are there any role models in particular that, you know, had an impact on you?
I think that the faculty in the endocrinology division at KU were very influential. Barbara Lukert, who was a bone specialist, also did general endocrine. Neil Shimke, who was the division chair, was one of those people who could just quote anything on any topic, and was very influential. And Joe Kiner did diabetes, and all of them were from Kansas. All of them were outstanding clinicians. They were excellent teachers and very committed to education. And I think that was the kind of role model I wanted. The other person who was very influential for me was Dr. James Kennedy, who was chief of medicine at the VA. Throughout my career as a student as well as a resident, I did a lot of rotations at the VA. And he was a general internist with an interest in endocrinology, and he was always tremendously supportive, and someone that I always felt had a lot of confidence that I was going to not only get through but do well. Not all of those, I think, were probably the primary role models I had.
Well, what was it like being a clinical medical student when you were in school? What did you do as a medicine clerk? What kinds of duties and so on did you have?
Well, we had a lot of direct patient responsibilities. Students were allowed or required, depending on how you look at it, to do more things. We got experience. I mean, by the time I finished medical school, I could put in a chest tube and do bone marrow biopsies. So a lot of direct hands-on clinical care and procedures. And at the VA, when we were on call, we had to do phlebotomy, EKGs, when a lot of the staffing wasn't there 24/7. And we did our own gram stains at night. And so there was a lot of just hands-on things that were, I think, more opportunities to do that than what students today have.
I was going to say, you know, the ward labs have closed for the most part, and the EKGs are done by technicians who make sure they get to the heart station to be read and reimbursed promptly. So medical students do quite a lot. Do you think there's a loss there?
I think there is, although I think the trade-off is that I think that it's, there's a trade-off in doing work that isn't directly related to the education for students. I mean, sometimes some of the things that were done, a lot of the starting IVs and phlebotomy was beyond what you needed to do for educational purposes. And so having more technical support is good. But I also think that some of the things that we were able to do and learn as students with hands-on experience now gets pushed off into residency, and things we could do as residents gets pushed off into fellowship. And so I think there's a loss in there, but I also think that it's not particularly educational to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go draw blood.
So was there a substantial didactic curriculum in your clerkship as well? Or was it mostly experiential?
I would say that was highly variable. Some of them, it was there was not as much standardization, but clearly there was a curriculum. I think there was probably more emphasis on self-directed learning, which isn't bad. I mean, my approach as a student and as a resident and as a fellow was that there's a body of knowledge I need to learn, and If I was on cardiology, I would get a textbook that was small enough I could read the entire thing during that clerkship. So I did a lot of it was self-directed, but there were clearly, because the faculty did not spend as much time on the documentation, they had more time to teach on rounds. So there was a lot of teaching on rounds.
Yeah.
And the endocrine rotations, when I was a student resident and certainly as a fellow, we did what were called data conferences. So all of the new patients, we would review the data and the findings on the new patients. And there's a lot of lab tests in endocrine. And we would review that as a division until you really got a lot of experiential learning, where a lot of case-based experiential learning. And so I would say it's not as structured perhaps as now, but more case-based, more teaching on rounds, because faculty had more time to do it then.
Yeah, I think when histories are written, the path audits are going to be seen as a major inflection point in clinical education. You know, the physicians at teaching hospital audits. I gave a talk in Reno, one of two talks I gave in Reno, and it was about the historical inevitability of hospital medicine. And I think that particular thing is not talked about very much, but it clearly withdrew many specialty internists from the wards, and so on.
The other thing that was different was the emphasis on the physical exam.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the attending physicians would demonstrate the physical examination on rounds, particularly in specialties like neurology and cardiology. And I don't see the emphasis on the physical exam and the teaching of the physical exam now that was. Well,
I think it's an interesting point. For one thing, I think the internal medicine physical exam has become restricted by consensus. I always carried an ophthalmoscope in my pocket, and I would make a point of examining the eyes on rounds and embarrassing the residents if they hadn't done it. But within the last 8 or 10 years or so, they're no longer embarrassed. You know, they don't have ophthalmoscopes, they don't know how to use them, and so on. And then the other thing is that I think their seniors, their senior colleagues are also less dependent on it. There was a well-known electrophysiologist here who didn't carry a stethoscope. And he said the only thing he needed to evaluate the heart was an echocardiogram, and the stethoscope was primitive technology. So you know, they learn from the way their mentors behave. What was your tuition like? Do you recall?
I remember it being considered very expensive. I think it was about $3,000 a year. The time was considered very expensive.
Yeah.
The tuition had recently gone up.
So I guess you didn't have to work outside school, is that right? With your husband having a full-time job?
Correct.
So were there classmates of yours that did work outside of school in order to help support themselves at that point?
I'm sure there were. I don't know of specific examples, but I'm sure there were.
Were you among a minority of married medical students with children at that point?
Yes.
Did that have an impact on your social life and who you spent time with during your medical school?
Yes, of course. Because I already had one child when I started medical school. My second one was born while I was in medical school, between my second and third years of medical school. And so I had a tremendous incentive to come in, get my work done, and go home, because I had two small children at home.
Sure.
And so our social life, I mean, certainly we had a number of colleagues who were other medical students and their spouses. Not many of I think there were a couple of the women who had children as well. There were some, but and certainly some of the men already had families. But most of our social life was with other people with similar circumstances. There were certainly people through my husband's work. We have family in the area. but I had a big incentive to get my work done and go home because
Sure.
children.
Sure. So like, so by this point, you're in the early 80s. Were there still significant challenges or barriers posed by gender?
I would say the biggest issue was the discouragement that certain fields were off limits because they wouldn't accept women, and certainly not women with children. I was told very specifically certain disciplines would not take women with children.
Do you recall which specialties those were at that point?
Surgery is one of them.
Yeah.
I was also told when I was a resident that GI wouldn't. I was told infectious disease wouldn't. Now that this is not from any authoritative source, but
Sure.
it was also for women who, it was just, there would have women having children, having babies while they were residents was really a pretty new phenomenon. And there just weren't these support services. So for women who were breastfeeding and pumping, they would have to pump in the bathroom or someplace. There were no lactation rooms. It was just a very different environment.
Is it better now at
Oh, I think it's much better. And I think there's, it's also more of a recognition that men need paternity leave too, which was, that was completely unheard of, paternity leave. And so I think for families in general, things are much better. It's not perfect, but it's certainly much better. And I think that there are probably at least subtle questions in interviews about plans for family, but overall those questions are not allowable when you're interviewing in terms of what family people have and what their plans are.
We still had to kind of forcefully remind people about forbidden questions as recently as a decade ago. I assume that you got queried about those sort of things when you were interviewing?
When I was interviewing for medical school, I was asked, how could a woman with a family go to medical school? How are you going to accommodate that? And as recently as just over 20 years ago, when I was interviewing for a job, I was told that they were reluctant to consider me as a candidate because I had a 9-year-old son, and they weren't sure that a woman with school-aged children could make the time commitment that they were expecting.
Mm.
So I would say that now it's the gender issues are far more subtle. When it's overt, it's there. When it's subtle, it leaves you wondering, well, did I just imagine that? Did that person say this on purpose? Or, it's just much more subtle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not completely gone. It's just more subtle.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So you stayed at Kansas for your internship and residency?
Yes, and fellowship. And then after I finished fellowship, I stayed on faculty at the University of Kansas for 9 years, but was at the VA. I went into the VA Career Development Program, which was research support for 3 years. And then I was asked to be the acting chief of medicine, and then went on to be the director of specialty care services. And then in 1998, I moved to UMKC and Truman Medical Center, which by changing institutions, started a different career path, but didn't have to move my family. So I've lived in the same house since I was in my fellowship.
Hmm. So the VA Career Development Awards are wonderful grants.
Yes.
They are great career developers. I helped a number of people get those grants. So what was your internship like when, in terms of workload and time off and duties and so on?
The program that I was in had every fifth night in-house call, so it wasn't as intensive as some, but every fifth night is still a lot of call. And rarely did we get weekends off. If we had a supervising resident who was supportive, he or she would make sure that you got 1 or 2 weekend days off during the 1 month rotation. So it was very intensive, and the interns do the bulk of the work of the admission process, the history and physical, the discharge summaries, the lot of hands-on patient care. So, and in the program that I was in, the on-call teams really only did the things you had to be physically present for. So you took in-house call every fifth night, but you took your beeper call every night. And so if you had someone you were anticoagulating, you'd get the calls about the pro times. And so even if though you were only in-house every fifth night, you still got a lot of phone calls. And there were, other than your vacation time, you worked, 80 to 100 hours a week every week.
Yeah, I was going to ask how much you worked, in terms of hours.
Yeah, it's probably, if you have a week that 2 on in-house calls come during the same week, it could be 120 hours. But yes, it was very different. And when you're the advantage of that is that when you admit patients on call, you keep those patients, your patients, because you admitted them, you saw them when they came in, you did the admission history and physical, and you really saw the whole evolution of their condition, and you knew your patients really well. And that's very different now than when the calls, a lot of them get transferred the next day, there's the short call. So it's very different. I think that the system that we had was unnecessarily brutal in terms of the hours that people worked, but there were aspects of it in terms of you really knew your patients and you kept them and you felt a sense of responsibility for them for their entire hospitalization. But on the other hand, we admitted people for workup of fever of unknown origin. We admitted people for liver biopsy. So it wasn't as though everyone on every patient on your panel was very, very ill. I mean, that's one of the things that I see as a difference now, is that the severity of illness and of everybody is much higher, but they also get discharged, and they get discharged quicker. So there's a lot more churn and turnover. So it's just very different.
Do you think, looking back on it, do you think that the workload and the support system, to the extent it existed, had an impact on your mental health or your resiliency during residency?
Well, I'm sure it did. You can't help but get burned out when you're working week after week, 80 to 100 hours and rarely get even one weekend day off. I think it certainly contributes to sleep deprivation and burnout. I think there has to be a happy medium in there where we look after the well-being of our residents and students and fellows, but still find those opportunities for them to have that sense of ownership of the patients assigned to them and to see the evolution of disease. And I think part of that involves more ambulatory medicine, because a lot of the evolution of disease is in the ambulatory setting, not in the inpatient wards.
Yeah, I agree with you. So you've already mentioned your first post-training position was at the University of Kansas. Were you seeing both general medicine and endocrine patients, or principally endocrine patients?
I did inpatient attending too. So I saw general internal medicine patients in the hospital. And then in the outpatient clinics, I only did endocrine and ambulatory setting.
So you mentioned that you assumed positions of greater responsibility at the Kansas City VA and then got recruited to UMKC. Can you dilate on that a little bit, tell a little bit more about how your career developed?
Well, I was a very happy person working in a research lab and doing clinical endocrine work. And then because of turnover above me at the chief of staff and chief of medicine positions, I was asked to step in as the acting chief of medicine, and I was not planning an administrative career, and agreed to do it. And it's a very, at this point, I think I was 3 years out of training, something like that. And it's a very funny feeling to then suddenly have the people who were your professors from medical school and residency now as one of the people who report to you. So it was like, oh, wow, I was not planning. This is not what I was planning. And I think that my journey into leadership positions was somewhat serendipitous, that it wasn't that I applied for positions I was asked to serve, but I also liked getting in onto committees where I felt you could make a difference. So, sometimes people don't like committee work, but if you want to make a difference, in your hospital or your medical school or wherever you are, you need to look at where are the decisions made. And so I had already been on the, one of the leadership committees, but P&T committees, promotion committees, there are certain committees that are important because they're where decisions are made. And so doing service in some of those areas, and if you are, I think, diligent about doing your work, come prepared, thoughtful, then sometimes people ask you to do something more. So an example, when I was at the VA, again, very happy in the things that I was doing. I was asked to serve on the curriculum renewal committee at KU for the medical school. And I'd never thought about curriculum and things like that. And turns out I really enjoyed that work because again, this is an important thing that makes a difference in how medical students are educated. And so doing some of those things, and then sometimes you discover there are things that you like. So when the opportunity at UMKC came up, it was to be one of what's called a docent. It's one of the teaching physicians for a team of students, and as an associate dean for academic affairs. And it's because I had that experience in curriculum and education. And then as I was as an associate dean for academic affairs, when our dean left suddenly, I was asked to be interim dean, and I said, yes, but I'll only do it for 2 years. Well, 13 years later, I said, I am going to do something else. But and a lot of the things that were academic administration drew on things that came out of administrative hospital administrative work when I was at the VA, because as the program director for specialty care services, I had all the internal medicine subspecialists, the surgeons, the ICUs, the operating rooms, the subspecialty clinics. And so there were a lot of just administrative things that are just common skills that apply in academic administration as well. So it was really kind of a serendipitous course. It wasn't that I was setting out. I'm much more deliberate about the things that I do now after leaving the dean's position than probably I was along the way.
Yeah, it's John Lennon said something to the effect that life is what happens when you're making other plans.
Yes. So, although you talk about influences, Karen Edison, who's a dermatologist at Mizzou and leads the Missouri Telehealth ECHO program. Something that she came out of retirement to work on a project she liked, and she said, it's my preferment And so now I've taken that to heart, and I do the things I prefer to do now.
Yeah, that's a remarkable program. I had an opportunity to be in a meeting with her while she, a telemeeting while she described it and so on. And it's, I think it's, they're doing something similar in Nevada, which is, of course, has enormous, lightly populated rural areas. And so I think that's an incredibly important model for rural states.
And there are many things that you can do with impact aside from the clinical practice of medicine. And I think that's something that as people advance through their careers, you start thinking about, okay, what are the things that I can do that have an impact, that bring me fulfillment, that aren't necessarily direct patient care?
So I'm interested to spend a little time on your career at UMKC, and I visited there, and I think the docent system is perhaps the best medical student education setup I've ever seen. I'm always surprised that more institutions don't emulate it, and my guess is it must be because it's very expensive of faculty time to do that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that it's a very good way to educate medical students. And there are a number of medical schools that have adopted something called learning communities. And so other schools have done it to some extent. It's the way it's done at UMKC is unique. And I think that it's not necessarily more expensive, but I think to do it, it has to be part of the original design. I think if you have a more traditional design, to go back and implement this later is very difficult to do. And so I think you almost have to do it from the very beginning.
Yeah, I guess Gray Diamond had the opportunity to build the medical school to meet his model. So you have the docents with the students surrounding them, and it would be hard to do any existing building footprint. So do you think the physical setup is important then?
The physical setup is very important because the physical proximity between students and the docents. And I would also mention that Richardson Novak, who's an internist, was one of the principal designers of the curriculum, and he still lives here in Kansas City. So I think when we think about the founding, we need to include Richardson Novak along with Dr. Diamond in that original design process. I think that the thing that really makes the docent teams are the longitudinal experience that you have with your docent, because you start as a year 3 student and go through year 6. So you got 4 years with that mentor. You do outpatient ambulatory clinic with them once a week for those 4 years, which helps you understand the evolution of disease, but it also really cements those relationships. And as the students are gathering to start clinic and they're talking among themselves, it's a little bit like driving with your kids in the back seat. You just overhear all kinds of things about what's just going on in life, and you really establish a relationship. It's beyond just teaching medicine. It's a relationship. And then also within the docent team, the year 3 students are paired with a senior partner, a year 5 student, and the 4s and 6s. And so you always have someone who can help mentor who's an older student a couple of years ahead of you. And as you become a year 5 and 6 student, you're going to be mentoring. So those relationships within the team are extremely important, long-term, longitudinal relationships. And just the repetitiveness of going to clinic every week, that redundancy is really important. And it's not that we're trying to push everyone to become internists, but it's that longitudinal experience in medicine that I think is really important.
So I haven't looked at this for a while, but it must be 15 years or so ago, I looked at the outcomes or the output of UMKC compared to other medical schools. And as I recall, the percentage of UMKC students who entered primary care specialties was about twice that of the national average at the time. Is that persisted?
Yes, it's persisted, although that includes people who go into internal medicine. And as you know, many of those go on
Right.
to fellowships or hospitalists. And so it's a little bit hard to track.
Yeah,
And
recognize
it varies. We have a lot more interested in family medicine right now, which family medicine has become the primary care specialty as opposed to general internal medicine that was very common when I was in training. A lot of my classmates did general internal medicine primary care after graduation.
Do you think that's a local phenomenon, or do you think that's national?
You mean that it's more family medicine?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a national trend.
It's interesting because, one of the things that's been noticeable to me about the college is that, subspecialists have left the college in droves. I looked at the numbers, and certainly that's true at the leadership level. And so there's this, I think, sort of quasi-religious view about the importance of primary care internal medicine, but realistically speaking, we don't do a very good job of attracting people to be interested in that sort of thing. So what do you think? What are you proudest of what you did at UMKC?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me come back to that one. Let me think about it.
So while you're thinking about that, how's your own practice? How did your practice of endocrinology change over the course of your career?
Well, as you do more administrative work, you have to narrow your focus. Looking at my colleagues who are deans in other specialties, if you're a procedurist, a surgeon, or a proceduralist, it becomes difficult to maintain your skills to get enough procedures. As an endocrine subspecialist, I narrowed my focus and did mostly calcium and bone work. And so I think narrowing the focus is really important. I think also having colleagues that you work with is, a group setting is really important. And then after I stepped out of the dean's role, I've done more general endocrine again, because I have time to stay up on the literature and had more practice opportunity, more time to practice.
Has your ability to help patients changed over the arc of your career?
The ability to help patients?
Yes.
That's a good.
To have better outcomes from the things that you offer.
Oh, in diabetes, absolutely. I mean, what we have to offer to prevent complications in diabetes. So during my career, we had the UK-PDS study that showed that diabetes control makes a difference in complications. We had the DCCT that showed in type 1 diabetes, tight control makes a difference in complications. We switched from using animal extract insulins to human insulins to recombinant insulins. We've got continuous glucose monitors. We've got statins and ACE inhibitors and ARBs that affect kidney disease progression. I mean, the tool, and now the new SGLT2s and the GLP-1 inhibitors that are as much cardiovascular drugs probably as diabetes drugs. The things that we have to offer that to make a difference in diabetes outcomes is just tremendous. And similarly in other areas, I mean, we've got effective osteoporosis drugs. Yes, we have much to offer, and I think endocrine being very data type practice, the ability to collect data, to look at the quality of your outcomes, to make sure that you're screening for kidney disease, to look collectively at your practice and practice outcomes. We've just got so many more tools now.
So it's a satisfying way to practice. Huh?
It is. I mean, I think that the how we use the electronic health record has quite a ways to go to be a tool that helps us rather than a tool for which we work.
Yeah, it's you may appreciate this as a former VA physician. you probably know this, that the CPRS was offered free to physicians nationwide, and the major impediment to its adoption was the lack of a billing component.
Yeah.
And it remains, when electronic medical records are valued, it remains one of the most popular, and the VA is busy trying to get rid of it. So it's kind of a shame. I sympathize with people who have to deal with Epic every day. I dealt with that when I was at UT Southwestern, and I didn't enjoy it.
I've never used that one. I've used, of course, the VA system, and I've used the Cerner system. We have a ways to go and part of the issue is that we've tried to keep practicing the same way and just kind of add in the electronic health record. And I think we need to redesign some of our processes so that it works better. But I think also the electronic health record has to be designed to fit within the flow of how we see patients. And in the VA system, we were involved in Kansas City in some of the early work. And one of the things that I insisted was, okay, how does this work for a physician seeing a patient in an exam room? It has to fit the flow of how we look for information and how we use information. And to some extent, I think as I said, our workflow processes need to change. And we can certainly find information now. I mean, how many times in your career earlier did you see patients that you couldn't find the last progress report?
Sure.
Find the lab results, and if you could, they were slips of paper glued on pieces of divider paper in the chart, and sometimes they fell out and it was lost forever. And to try to follow the course of disease, or follow the course of renal function was just very difficult. And then communicating with patients through the portals, I love doing that because and so there are a lot of really good things, but I think physicians at the point of contact with patients in the clinic spend far too much time with the electronic health record rather than with the patient themselves.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting challenge. What do you think about the recent dramatic cost increases for insulin, and what solutions might there be?
Well, I think for something that is literally a life-saving drug, and that people with type 1 diabetes their lives literally depend on it, the cost is, we've got to find a way that it's affordable for everyone. And as you know, there are a lot of issues with affordability that have to do with benefits management and the way the insurance companies are set up. And there are just tragic stories of people who literally die because of lack of access to their insulins, or people who go into ketoacidosis. There's one study that shows that 25% of people ration their insulin. So we have to find a better way to do that. And maybe I can't think of another drug that's really the equivalent of insulin that is, for people with type 1 diabetes, have to have it every day, that their lives literally depend on it. So we have some way of subsidizing that cost for people who can't afford it.
It's been quite a change in the ethos. I think the inventors, Banting and Best and McLeod, refused to patent the drug.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And yet, a century later, we have people attempting to make windfall profits from it. So.
Well, and you can get NPH and regular insulin without a prescription at Walmart for $25 of the Walmart brand. But we're so influenced by the latest products that there aren't as many physicians around who even know how to use NPH and regular insulin. It's all the newer insulins that are pushed. So I think one of the things we need to do is to teach cost-effective medicine so people know how to use these kinds of generic and less expensive drugs that maybe not perfect, but can certainly keep people alive.
So maybe rotating back to your time at UMKC, I assume one of the things you're proud of is creating the endocrine fellowship.
Yes, I am very proud of creating an endocrine fellowship. Proud of creating graduate programs, including the anesthesiologist assistance program, a physician assistance program, master's degree in bioinformatics and health professions education, and now even PhD level training in bioinformatics. And the reason we did the graduate programs in bioinformatics and health professions education was partly to support the basic science of clinical medicine, to increase scholarly work, because many physicians, academic physicians, spend so much time in direct patient care that they really need those partnerships with people who are PhDs in epidemiology and statistics, and it really takes a team, I think, to do research. And those are the basic sciences. Really, the basic sciences of clinical medicine are those kinds of sciences. And it also supports residents and fellows in designing better projects. And so really looking at how we have an infrastructure that supports research, including clinical research, was something that I worked on.
Did either of your children become physicians?
I have 3 children.
Three children, okay.
2 of them are engineers and 1 is a data scientist. So none of them became physicians, but I didn't discourage it. I mean, I think it has to be their choice.
Yeah, sure. So I assume you still advise students to become an internist, is that right?
I advise students, but I advise them to do what they want to do. I don't try to push them to become internists. But certainly if they're interested in internal medicine, then I talk to them about, okay, how do you prepare for that, and how to competitive application for residency, and why internal medicine is attractive to people, what people like about it. And but I think it's really important for all of our students to feel that they have free choice to select the career that's best for them.
Sure.
Best advice I had, best career advice I had was from Dr. Kennedy at the VA, who said, find something to do when you're 50 that you still enjoy getting up and going to work every day. I think you could say 60 in there too, but find something to do that brings you joy in your career.
Sure.
Like to do.
Yeah, I used to tell residents that they should pick the area for specialization that interests them, as opposed to what they think they're going to make a lot of money in, because the money can change overnight. I watched general surgery more or less get wiped out by cimetidine and interventional radiology, and I've watched cardiovascular surgery take huge hits because of the advances in cardiology and lipid biochemistry and so on. So I think that choosing something, based on how much money you think you're going to make is fraught with peril. So
I do too. And if you're just doing it for the money, then you're miserable getting up and going to work every day. The additional money is not worth it. The other good piece of advice I had was actually from Dr. Diamond, who said that every 10 years you should do something different, whether it's changing jobs or do something different within the institution where you are. And I think you need it for your own personal renewal. And I see people doing, going into quality work, doing teaching if they weren't doing it before, just some aspect of their clinical practice. And it's just tremendously renewing to do something a little different every 10 years.
You have specific pieces of advice that you give to young women, either entering medical school or during medical school or in the course of their careers, that were lessons that you learned?
I think that you should not consider anything that is off limits that you can't do. That there's no career in medicine that you can't do as a woman, even if you have a family. I think that probably the two most important things is, one, don't let yourself get isolated. There are studies that show that women in science tend to be more isolated. And if you allow yourself to get isolated, you think, oh, well, other people aren't experiencing this or whatever. You really need a network, and you need to maintain a robust network of people. So you have a frame of reference that's good, and you have a support system. Second would be that, actually, I'm going to say three things. Second would be that you need in that network mentors and sponsors, which are different things. And they don't have to all be women. I mean, you pick the people that have the mentoring skills that are right for the things that you need to do. And it may be a group of people, it may not be a single individual, and that's different than sponsorship, someone who can nominate you or support a nomination. Don't be isolated. Group of people who can be mentors and sponsors. And the third thing I would say is that you can have it all, but you may not be able to have it all at the same time. I remember being, when I told you I had never met a woman physician when I started medical school. I joined the student chapter of the American Medical Women's Association, which was wonderful because there were practicing women physicians who met with us on a regular basis. And it was very important to see those women could be successful in practice, have families and things. And I remember one of them said, well, you can't do everything. You have to pick and choose the things that are most important to you. And if you don't like to shop for groceries, you can order food, or you can have somebody do that. You don't have to do everything. So I think you can have it all, but you may not be able to have it all at one time. And so when your kids are small, your house may not be quite as neat as it is when you're my age and your kids are all grown and nobody's moving things around in your house when you're not there. So be realistic about what you can do and don't put too much pressure on yourself.
So if you were Biden's healthcare advisor, what would be the single most important piece of advice you'd give him?
I think for people who are in advancing ages, the most important thing is good nutrition and exercise. This helps your brain. It helps you function higher. It also helps you maintain muscle mass. For healthy aging and a healthy brain, you absolutely have to address good nutrition and exercise, including resistance exercise. I think that those are essential. And if you ask me for a second thing, I would say for every prescription that's written for you, ask 2 or 3 times if you really need to take that medication. You don't want to be over-medicated as a person who's in their 80s.
Yep. So a final question, a summary question, I guess. If you had your life to live over again, would you change anything?
I certainly would not change going into medicine, would not change having a family. I would not change going into internal medicine and endocrinology. I think all of those things have worked out well for me. And having a family while practicing medicine and having, a demanding career in, academic administration, I would say that my family was the most important thing in supporting me. It gives you balance. It gave me balance in my life. And my children were incredibly supportive. And I would not change anything. Yeah. One of the questions on the list that you didn't ask me about was ACP. And I've been an ACP member since I was in my residency. And I have no regrets about that. And I think it's important as internists that we have a sense of belonging to an organization. And I have found the ACP very supportive with educational materials and practice support. And so I have no regrets about that either.
Great. That brings the interview to an end. Thank you very much.